The subject we have today is Mahler 2, the second symphony of Gustav Mahler, which we had planned. So I'll talk a little bit about it, and then Erica, you're going to act as sort of a moderator with questions if
Indeed.
People have it. Yeah, okay. So many of you, not all of you, played the Mahler Third Symphony last, I think we did last season, is that right? 2 seasons ago, last season maybe, we did Mahler 3, did we not?
We did, Maestro.
What, we did?
We did, yes.
Yeah. So there are 9 symphonies by Gustav Mahler. There is a 10th symphony which has only 1 movement completed. It's an adagio. And then there is a song cycle, the Song of the Earth, Das Lied von der Erde, which makes altogether 10 major symphonic works by Gustav Mahler. I apologize if I repeat some obvious information, but so he was born in 1860, died in 1911. He was 51 when he died. Of the symphonies, his output as a composer, let's say in comparison to Strauss, is very limited, in part because he was better known and more highly employed and regarded as a conductor. So he went to the Vienna Conservatory in the 1870s. So he was about 15 years old when he went to Vienna. He was born in Moravia, and which is now part of the Czech Republic. And he actually majored in 3 subjects. One was piano, so he won a coveted prize for his piano playing. He played a concerto by Chervenka, a composer who's actually been largely forgotten. He also submitted a piece for a composition prize. Now, it's unclear who his composition teachers were. There's a lot of dispute at the Vienna Conservatory whether how much and to what extent he studied with Anton Bruckner, who didn't teach composition at the conservatory, but only counterpoint and harmony and counterpoint. He didn't actually teach composition. So in a conservatory in the 19th century, the teaching of composition was an ambiguous thing. It was mostly the technique of how to put music together. So Bruckner, for example, who was a member of the faculty when Gustav Mahler was a student. So if all of you are undergraduate students, can understand what this might be like. So you go to a conservatory and one of your teachers is Bruckner. One of the dominant members of the board is Johannes Brahms, and they don't get along. Brahms had very little regard for Bruckner, and Bruckner likewise for Brahms. And Bruckner and Brahms were the dominant musical figures that surrounded the conservatory. The conservatory was housed in the same building as the major concert hall of Vienna. So if you look Vienna up, or many of you who will go to Vienna at some point, the most famous concert hall in the world probably is the so-called Musikverein, which means music society. Music society. So this was a building paid for by membership in a society for music, plus a lottery, plus a gift by the king. It was built by the emperor. It was built by a Danish architect, Theophil von Hansen, who also built the Austrian parliament, which is on a big street, which is circular, called a ring. And the Ring was a kind of big boulevard, kind of Fifth Avenue, Champs-Élysées, for the people in the mid-19th century, it must have looked like a gigantic highway. So a multi-lane road. And that road has the geography of a walled city. So Vienna was a medieval walled city until the 1850s. And the emperor decided to tear the walls down and modernize the city. And by tearing them down, there was a lot of empty space, and they built public buildings, symbolic public buildings, the kind of building you'll see in Washington, D.C., like the Capitol, like the Supreme Court, these kinds of buildings. And they were very new buildings. So the first building to be opened on this newly created street was the opera, the Vienna Opera. This was a kind of 19th century version of a Renaissance and Baroque structure. And they built a theater, a parliament, a stock exchange, a military garrison, and a city hall, and a museum of natural history, and a museum of art. So all the public spaces were on this ring, and one of those buildings was this concert hall, which held a concert society that had been founded in 1812, and was the main concert hall. And in that concert building were two, as in Fisher Center, there are two performance spaces, a big one and a small one, and the rest of the space was the conservatory. And the way students heard concerts by the Vienna Philharmonic, which were very few, by the way, the concert life when Mahler was a student was relatively limited. If you lived in Vienna, you were a citizen of Vienna, between 1870 and 1914, you probably had an opportunity to hear live every Beethoven symphony once. So you have to understand the access to orchestral sound was very limited. The entire seating capacity of this hall was 1,400. And the city had well over 1 million people in population. And there weren't concerts every week. The Philharmonic maybe gave 15 concerts a year, if at that. A second orchestra, a professional orchestra, wasn't created in Vienna until the early 20th century. So Gustav Mahler is a student. All his knowledge of music is from in his head and his ability to make piano reductions. One of his first publications was a piano reduction of a Bruckner symphony, the third symphony, which is so-called the Wagner symphony. I tell you all this because it's important for you in your ears to have an idea of what he was trying to do as a composer. So he's a young student, and although Bruckner is an elderly, bald guy, a devout Catholic, which is important to remember, who is today would never get a job because he was too much of a nut, wouldn't get a job in an American university. And Mahler's generation adored him. They revered him. And they didn't think much of Brahms. They thought Brahms was old-fashioned, too tied to a kind of old Beethoven, Mozart, it wasn't modern enough. It wasn't, for them, Bruckner took Wagner, which was, what does that mean? He took the enlarged orchestra, a non-classical orchestra, but the most important thing, he used two things that Wagner was great at: duration and sonority, repetition through sonority. So the Bruckner symphonies got very long, very long. I mean, the longest symphony probably in the repertory by the time Gustav Mahler became a student was maybe the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, and possibly the Second Symphony of Mendelssohn, which also has a choral ending, or called the Hymn of Praise, Lobgesang. So he arrives as a student from the provinces. You have to imagine that Gustav Mahler arrives in New York City, and he grew up in Saugerties or Red Hook, right? And his father owned a liquor store in Red Hook, right? And now he comes to the big city, and his friends, Hans Roth, who is a composer, and he's somewhat the same generation as the song composer Hugo Wolf, and they are virulent defenders of Bruckner, and Bruckner is controversial. The audiences don't like it. They hiss it. Bruckner is overwhelmed with self-doubt. He makes many versions of his symphonies. And Mahler's first publication with a friend of his is actually Krzyżanowski is the guy's name. They do a four-hand piano version of Bruckner 3. That's very important to remember. If you do a piano version of a whole symphony, you've got to look at that symphony really carefully. You got to figure out what that's about. The same way, if you want to understand Wozzeck by Berg, you have to realize that it's Berg who made the piano reduction of the distant sound by Schreker. He did the piano reduction. So he looked at this thing, how does this guy write an opera? That's the way you learn how to do that. So he studied piano and he studied composition. He did not win the Beethoven Prize, which was the prize. So any of you who think winning a prize while you're an undergraduate is important, forget about it. Most people who win prizes end up in oblivion. Right? You know, for every Prix de Rome, which was the prize for French composers from the Paris Conservatory, for every person we like Debussy, who is famous, there are a host of people you've never heard of, and perhaps for good reason. Conducting, as for Andras would say, conducting was not a subject. Was not a subject. There was no Harold Farberman. There was no textbook of nobody. Conducting was, first of all, people. There was unlimited rehearsal time, and no one really quite knows how they got through this. But by the time Mahler was a student, there were great conductors already. Most importantly was Hans Richter, who is the conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic and also the person to premiere Wagner's Ring of the Nibelungen at Bayreuth. And the way students got to hear orchestral music is they hid under the floor of the concert hall. They could not get in. The best they could do was to stand in the back, but most of them crawled under the rafters to hear these concerts. And Mahler's first job after graduating from conservatory was actually to conduct. Actually, his first public appearance was as a pianist. He went back home and did a piano recital, I think. But and the way you started to conduct in those periods of time, the real entertainment was opera. Orchestral concerts were not a thing of itself. They were offshoots. The Vienna Philharmonic is a subset of the orchestra of the Vienna State Opera to this day. You can't be a member of the New York Philharmonic without being first a member of the State Opera Orchestra. Since an opera plays every night, you can't have the same people playing. So if you have an average of 70 people in the pit, you have to have an orchestra roster of 200. And they choose among themselves who's going to be in the Vienna Philharmonic. So it was when Mahler was a student. And he grows up, he comes of age in Vienna in a circle of young people, all the same age, the same you are, of the same age, who have a fierce commitment to the future of music that is represented by Wagner and by Bruckner, as opposed to a conservative, old-fashioned view of music that's represented by Brahms. Now, this is a simplification, but it's important to remember that. And he wants to be a composer. And because of Wagner and Bruckner, he doesn't think small. He does write a piano quartet while he's in conservatory, which we have I think we have either all of it or a fragment of it. And what he really wants to do is he wants to write an opera. The real way you make your name is like being a film composer. So you want to be a composer, you want to be Tan Dun. You want to do what Tan Dun does. Because to write a symphony for a bunch of old people, white old people in a concert hall is a waste of time. But if you can write a movie score, right? Like The Last Emperor, what's it? The Dragon and Tiger one, whatever it's called, right? So that's now you're hitting a home run. Now that's serious, right? So these guys want to write operas. That was the entertainment. Every town had an opera house. Every city had an opera house. And that's where your money was made. And if you write a good opera, you get excerpts from the opera. You get hit tunes from the opera. And you can actually make some money. In Vienna at the time, the most important opera composer was somebody who hung around the conservatory, who was friendly with Brahms, a very fine composer of the name Karl Goldmark. Most famous opera is called The Queen of Sheba. We also wrote an opera called Merlin. I'll come back to Karl Goldmark in a moment. Hugo Wolf, who was a classmate of Mahler, became a very famous song composer, was also notorious for writing nasty music criticism against Brahms. Incredible, hostile music criticism. Was desperate to do an opera. And one of the tensions between Mahler and Hugo Wolf later in life is that I don't think he thought Mahler as supportive of his own opera Corregidor, which is not a successful theater piece. But anyway, they were friendly. They had a third friend whose name was Hans Roth, R-O-T-T. And Hans Roth killed himself in an insane asylum, or died in an insane asylum. He went bananas, he lost his marbles, believed that Brahms was trying to kill him. He left a first symphony, which had a big influence as a student on Mahler. It's been recorded. I've performed it, other people have performed it. It's worth looking up. You can get it on YouTube. Hans Roth Symphony No. 1, well, the only one actually. It's a Mahlerian kind of symphony and it made a big impression on Gustav Mahler. It's really very Brucknerian, and Bruckner liked this student. And he was crazy and he had a persecution complex about Brahms trying to ruin him. Give you an idea of the intensity of feelings. So Mahler's first ambition was to write an opera, and he never succeeded. Never wrote a single opera in his life, although he was one of the greatest opera conductors in history. He tried on a fairy tale, a German fairy tale, sort of Rapunzel, you know, Rapunzel with the long hair, the Rapunzel fairy tale. And very popular were romantic fairy tales for opera subjects, but one never appeared. He never wrote an opera. But the other important way to make money and survive as a composer is to write songs. Songwriting, like Schubert, Karl Löwe, Brahms, Schumann, because people made music in their homes. And you didn't write for opera singers. This was not songs that you needed to be Pavarotti or Anna Netrebko to sing. You could just carry a tune. and perhaps have a child, partner, parent, neighbor who played the piano. The piano was the central, crucial, indispensable computer of musical knowledge. It was the instrument, those 88 keys were the ticket. There was no musician, whatever instrument he or she played, that couldn't get around a piano, because that's how you learned. You couldn't turn on a machine and hear a symphony. You took a piano version of the Beethoven symphony or the score itself, you learned how to transpose, and you played either by yourself or with someone sitting with you, four hands. You played through the entire repertory. Songwriting, if you were successful at it, was a good business. So opera writing and songwriting. Mahler's first job is as a conductor in a resort town. And you learn conducting in the pit with voices and a stage. And he did light opera, Lortzing, Saaren, Zimmermann. He did anything that came at him. And he obviously had the personality for it. Very energetic, very charismatic. And his career as a conductor, opera conductor, exploded. He went from there, finally he found himself in Leipzig, which is in Saxony, which is one of the great centers of musical life of 9th century Europe. It's where the publishing industry was centered. So Peters was there, Breitkopf and Hertel were there. It had a very famous orchestra, one of the first in Europe, the Gewandhaus. And there he met the grandson of the composer Carl von Weber. Carl von Weber, a great composer of operas and piano music, even symphonies. And for those who are clarinetists, 2 beautiful clarinet concertos, and a great expert in the use of wind instruments. In Leipzig lived Weber's grandson, who had an unfinished manuscript by Weber of an opera. So it's, imagine you're Jane Austen, and you're Jane Austen's granddaughter, and you have the sketches of a novel that was never published, and you know how popular Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility and Emma are, and they were turned into movies, and you have this unfinished novel. Comes along young person, in this case Gustav Mahler, and this grandson, who is a music lover, shows Mahler these sketches and hires Mahler, this is the grandson, to finish the opera. The opera is called The Three Pintos. It's some kind of complicated story. I'm the only person in America have ever conducted a performance in New York at Tully Hall of it. But Die Drei Pintos, it's a lot of fun. It's written in the style of Carl von Weber, so it's written in the early 9th century style. It's very light, it's very funny. Most of the music is Mahler. So he took the style of Carl von Weber and turned it into a kind of Weber opera. It's a little, the orchestration is a little bit more elaborate than Weber might have used, but it's a classical orchestra. It was a huge success. Now that's all very well and good. It's important, again, for the background of this, because Mahler then gets bigger and better jobs. He's got a good job in Leipzig. Meanwhile, I won't go into it, he starts to sleep with the wife of Weber's grandson, which is a complicated matter and slightly messy, mixing love and work. And so he has to hightail it out of there to avoid a scandal. He ends up in Hamburg. Now, Mahler is born 1860, so now he's about 30 years old, and he's in Hamburg. And no, he first goes to, yes, And then he goes to Budapest as the conductor of the Budapest Opera. And by 1897, he becomes the director of the Vienna Opera at age of 37. In the meantime, having become very famous as a conductor, he hasn't lost his ambition to compose. And he, partly influenced by already the success of his competitor, Richard Strauss, who was also a conductor and a composer, he goes in two directions, both directions Strauss did: songs and orchestral music. He couldn't actually figure out how to do an opera, but he takes the Wagnerian idea of storytelling, the Brucknerian sound, and the scale, the length, and the dramatic scope of an opera, of a theater, the theatricality, a fundamental theatricality of orchestral music. All of us who play in an orchestra know that part of our attraction to the audience is a kind of theater of it. The big theater, the sound, everything from the whispering flute to a violin solo, to a gigantic cymbal crash, and two sets of timpani and all kinds of brass instruments. You're telling a story, a dramatic story. And the idea of telling a dramatic story in music was second best to writing an opera. And Mahler was a reader. And what we know about what he read is he was very attracted not so much to contemporary literature of his own time, but early Romantic literature. So there are two pieces of literature which are relevant for the Second Symphony, which he reads when he's in his 20s. One is a collection of poetry published in the early part of the 19th century, which is pseudo folk poetry. So it's not folk poetry, but it is pseudo folk poetry about simple people and life and death. So remember, we're in the midst of a pandemic. But for the early 19th century, when life expectancy was at best in the late 30s, early 40s, and death at childbirth was totally common, and there was no protection against any kind of infectious disease. This folk poetry, Romantic folk poetry, was obsessively concerned with death. Same with Schubert, because it was omnipresent. If you feel your life is always at risk, the intensity of the life that you lead, one always asks the question, why did so many people in this generation die early, Nietzsche included, of syphilis, which they contracted in the early years of their sexual activity? They knew that this venereal disease was fatal, but they also realized, I don't have any guarantee to live to 70. I don't have any guarantee to ride to 60 to 50. Their notion of time was very different from our notion of time. The poetry of the early 19th century that attracted Mahler came from a collection called The Boy's Golden Horn, des Knaben Wunderhorn. And these collected by two wonderful writers, Clemens von Brentano and Achim von Arnim. And these were a collection of poetry that had presumed folk roots. It was simple, beautiful, not flowery, romantic, but very elegant. And one of those texts appears in the Second Symphony. So Mahler takes one of the songs he wrote and inserts it as a movement in the Second Symphony. The other piece of literature he read is by the Polish poet, the most famous Polish poet of all time, and a romantic figure of the name Adam Mickiewicz. Adam Mickiewicz was, like Chopin, a Polish patriot. Background is that Poland was dismembered as an independent country in the 1790s. Mickiewicz was very young when that happened. And one of the things, and it was cut up, three powers, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, cut it up into three pieces. They gobbled it up. It's as if Mexico and Canada and England divided America into three pieces. And each of them took one piece, right? The result was that the literate nobility and educated classes of Poland became violently patriotic, and Poland was seen as a victim. And Mickiewicz put that sense of being a victim into poetry. Poland was the Christ of Europe, and its death would be followed by a resurrection. You hear me? By a resurrection, that Poland would rise again. Mickiewicz and Chopin were deeply affected by the first Polish revolt, which was in 1830, which was put down by the Russians. They didn't live to see the Polish revolt of 1863, which was also put down by force. And finally, the creation of independent Poland in 1918 at the end of the First World War. Adam Mickiewicz was the Byron, the Shakespeare of the Polish language, the Walt Whitman of the Polish language. And one of his poems, called Dziady, which means My Ancestor's Evening, is a four-part poem about a hero whose name is Gustav. Clue number one, Gustav Mahler's first name. And he's a romantic hero. Mickiewicz struggled with this poem for a long time. You can find it in English translation, by the way. It exists in English translation. And one of the sections of the poem deals with heroism and death and resurrection. And one of the forefathers' evenings is the celebration of the memory of our forefathers and the obligation in the new generation to bring them back to life, so to speak. For those of you who are in a dual degree program, Mahler took a dual degree program too. So if anybody says to you, why am I doing a dual degree program? Let me just play the violin. Gustav Mahler did it too. Every student at the conservatory was also enrolled in the university. And he studied literature and things like that, and philosophy, a lot of philosophy. And he met friends, and one of his friends was a poet by Siegfried Lippener, who translated Mickiewicz's Forefathers' Eve into German. And Mahler loved it. He decided to write a tone poem on this part of the big poem by Mickiewicz, taking one part of it, and it was entitled The Celebration of the Dead, the celebration of the death of a hero. This Gustav, right? It's himself, right? If you want to surround yourself by self-centered people, surround yourself with composers. In order to be a composer, the level of self-involvement has to be profound. You'll never find a composer whose other career was a nurse. So there's one doctor composer, I think. There's only one doctor composer. I'm trying to think who was a physician composer. There was a Russian. Borodin was a chemist. I don't know if any of them actually had a medical practice. I'll come up with somebody. Anyway, there are poets and writers who are doctors, but not composers in any event. So the idea that this hero's name was Gustav, and so he's going to write a tone poem that is called the celebration of the death, Totenfeier in German. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, he's now famous as a conductor, and of course, whom should he meet but Richard Strauss. And how did he meet Richard Strauss? Through a mutual mentor, a guy I talked about last time, Hans von Bülow, the pianist who married Cosima Wagner, whom Wagner married. He got cuckolded and then became a supporter of Brahms and took over the Meiningen Orchestra. And that's where Strauss got his start as a conductor and a composer. Bülow, who was a real showman, also became conductor of the nascent Berlin Philharmonic, which has a much younger history than the Vienna Philharmonic. And Bülow was kind of the Leonard Bernstein for his generation. He was a kind of a king of orchestral performance and conducting by that time in Germany, German-speaking Europe. And Mahler attracted his attention. And Mahler played for him on the piano the first movement of the Second Symphony, which was originally conceived as a self-standing piece of music, just on its own, with one story. This hero's story inspired by Mickiewicz. Similar Liszt, kind of a tone poem, or Don Juan, or A Hero's Life, or Heldenleben, or Don Quixote, that kind of thing. Bülow didn't like it, but Richard Strauss, who admired Mahler the conductor, invited Mahler to conduct it in a concert in the Berlin Philharmonic in the 1890s. And then Mahler thought, wait a minute, how can I put this into a much larger framework? So the first one was not conceived as part of a symphony. You understand what I'm saying? It wasn't conceived as the first movement of the symphony. The other analogy, for those of you who know the repertoire, is the Schumann Piano Concerto. The Schumann Piano Concerto was just a one-movement work. The other two movements were added on later. The same thing with Mahler, too. The first movement was Totenfeier and had made its first public appearance. So if you ever go to a concert and they only do the first movement of Mahler 2, and you think, oh, they don't know what they're doing, there's a legitimacy in just doing the first movement. It's not so legitimate because Mahler was an incessant reviser. Because he was such a terrific conductor and most of his life was on the podium, he changed his mind about all of his orchestrations. So he fiddles with this piece for 15 years. The last changes are made in 1909, 1910. So let's say the score that Andras would look at carefully is the last version of Mahler 2. There are small changes, but there are changes. And that's why there's a big break between the first movement and the rest of the piece. It goes born by itself. To continue the story of Hans von Bülow, Mahler is stung by the fact that Bülow didn't like the music. But lo and behold, Hans von Bülow dies. And Mahler goes to his funeral. And he's thinking about how to make this, take the first, put the Totenfeier and make it the first movement of a multi-movement symphony with a big arc, a big argument. And he's already decided on this the poem from the Boy's Magic Horn. That's going to be a movement. And he's sitting in the funeral for Hans von Bülow. And in the funeral, they sing a hymn with a text by an 18th century German poet, early 19th century poet, of the name Klopstock, on resurrection. Why? Because those of you know, in Christian religion, we've just passed Easter, the central miracle of the theology of Catholicism is the resurrection of Christ. It's not the birth of Christ. It's not even the virgin birth. It's not either the virgin birth or the Immaculate Conception, which are two different things. Immaculate Conception and the virgin birth have to do with the origin of Mary and the origin of Christ. And both, as in the Greek for Athena, are separated from sexuality, normal sexuality. That is miraculous, but much less important than rising from the dead. And Jesus doesn't simply rise from the dead, he stays on earth and he visits the apostles before the final ascension to heaven. But the important part is death, which is the central preoccupation of Mahler's the entire 19th century. Death is cheated of its finality. If you believe that you're just body and you believe from dust to dust, death has one set of meanings. If you believe that you're body and soul, which means your body may become dust. But one of the most important tenets of modern Christianity in the 19th century was the immortality of the soul. And the interpretation of resurrection was that the Spirit of Christ ultimately ascended to heaven, although he appears on earth in human form for 40 days before the final ascension. So Mahler's in this, shows you how when inspiration comes. Mahler's in this funeral for this guy who didn't really like him, but whom Mahler revered, as you know, and he suddenly he has inspiration. He's going to use the same poem that was sung at Bülow's funeral, and he's going to make it like Beethoven. These were ambitious guys. These guys didn't think small. They didn't think, oh, I'm going to make a little sailboat. They went in their garage and made a 747. You follow me? They weren't building, a toy car. They were building a tank. They were thinking really big and monumentally. A monumental piece of music. They were not thinking about writing a hit tune. They were thinking about bringing the world down and tackling the most difficult questions of life, the meaning of death, and that of memory, heroism, and resurrection. The permanent, immortal parts of life. And music was the right instrument to talk about it. So he has no better business than decide he's going to write another Ninth Symphony. He's going to end this symphony. Now he's got all the pieces. He's got the opening piece, he's got the Urlicht, and now he's got a closing piece. He just had one more movement to go and he's done. Right? And that's how the symphony comes into being, pretty quickly. And it's performed in Berlin and becomes, I think, arguably, so the first symphony started out as a 5-movement piece. It also had a program. He dropped one movement in the first symphony to make it a 4-movement. Then the second, the third symphony, with a Nietzsche text, among others. And then he has the fourth symphony, which ends with a vocal, again, with a connection to Knabenwunderhart. Then, like Strauss, he gets nervous about programs and texts and decides he's not going to do that anymore. And so there are the Wunderhorn symphonies, the Boys' Magic Horn symphonies, and that includes 1, 2, 3, and 4. 5, 6, and 7 are pretty much, and not 8 and 9. And 8 has chorus in it, but that's somewhat a different matter. But certainly 5, 6, and 7 and 9 don't have a real program. They're not based on literary things or tales. Number 2 is. Later in life, he wants to get rid of the stories. But the Second Symphony is arguably his favorite symphony. It's the one he chooses to conduct when he goes to New York. So Gustav Mahler's career kept going. He was a conductor in Hamburg. Then he was director in Budapest. And he ended up taking over the Vienna Opera, which was an imperial institution under the direct control of the Emperor of Austria. And he displaces, of all people, Hans Richter, the hero of his childhood. Not childhood, of his young adulthood. And he directs the opera house and is conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic. And he combines with artists of his own period in 10 years of immensely creative productions of operas. He's never invited to conduct in Bayreuth. I'll come back to that in a moment. Although he was a member when he was in college, you all are members of clubs. Many of you are members of clubs. Well, he was a member of a club too. The club he was a member was the Wagner Club of Vienna. He was a member of the Wagner Club of Vienna when he was a student at the university. And he hung around with young Wagnerians and writers. His sister married the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic, Arnold Rosé, Justine, and they had a daughter, Alma Rosé, violinist, who has a recording of her doing, Erica, I'm not mistaken, the Bach double with her father. And she died in concentration camp during the Nazi period. She ran an orchestra. There's a film actually about her, and there are many books about Alma Rosé. In any event, and Mahler is very prominent in Vienna, but he gets into trouble. He becomes controversial. The opera is like a sports team. So many of you know that if you are in a city and you have a basketball team and it never wins, right? Or does win, or you have a football team, Andras can smile, you're a soccer team, and the soccer team doesn't do diddly squat. And whom do they hammer? The coach. Or the bunch of star players. Even if you're winning, the star players hate the guts of the coach. And the most important, the LeBron James of the basketball team, right, who's 9/10 of the income, hates the guts of the coach. Who goes, LeBron James or the coach, right? And that's exactly what happened at the Vienna Opera. The big stars, the singers, the Pavarottis, the Callas's, the Prendros, the big shot stars and divas didn't like Gustav Mahler because Gustav Mahler thought music first, diva second, which means if you want to hit a high C and you want to hold on to it for a couple of hours, that's your business. But it's not what the composer wrote, and you're going to hold on to the high C exactly what is written in the score, and you come down. You want to repeat an aria because you're famous, right? Because the crowd is cheering because they bought the ticket just to see you sing that aria. And the conductor says, stuff it, you're not going to do it. The score counts. Okay, well, these kind of conductors were not popular. What was popular with the audience were conductors who were very meek. And I went to the concert with Kathy Battle, which the fact that I actually survived the event was a miracle. But there are people who are real, divas, they're calling the shot. The conductor is nobody, And Mahler didn't take lip from anybody. So there was a lot of intrigue around the opera. And after 10 years, he wore out his welcome. And the Americans came along from the promised land, and they offered him millions of dollars to come to New York. And he came to New York to conduct not the New York Philharmonic, but the Metropolitan Opera. And one of his first productions was Tristan. He was a great Wagnerian, great Wagnerian. However, he was hired by the general director of the Metropolitan Opera, who was a German. This guy died. Shortly after Mahler arrived, he was replaced by an Italian, Gatti Casazza, who promptly took Arturo Toscanini and got Mahler kicked out of the Metropolitan Opera. So Toscanini arrives and revises the whole Met scene, and Mahler is the victim of that intrigue. He stays in New York for 3 years because he becomes conductor of what is today the New York Philharmonic. The first symphony of his own that he conducts with the New York Philharmonic is Mahler II. The last symphony he conducts in Vienna is Mahler II. So of all the Mahler symphonies, this symphony somehow stuck in his brain as somehow representing himself most deeply. Now, let me turn to the last subject and open the floor to questions. The piece has a very unusual history. It was always viewed as, I don't think so. It's not my opinion, but you need to know the standard opinion, that it is always viewed as the most representative symphony in Gustav Mahler's output. And it also is viewed to be the most emotionally gripping, which is why Leonard, when John Kennedy was shot, the President of the United States, Leonard Bernstein did famously a broadcast of Mahler II. That the piece has a regular place in the repertory for its emotional, psychological, even religious implications. Bring me to the last subject. Gustav Mahler, as I told you, was born in Moravia, in, let's call it, Red Hook of Moravia. He was born into a Jewish family. Bernhard Mahler, his father, was in the liquor business, in the spirits business. There's a tremendous amount of literature has been expended on Mahler's childhood. And every artist's biography should be read by you with some suspicion. Because ever since Vasari wrote the lives of the great artists in the Renaissance, the life of an artist couldn't be ordinary. If you follow me, they couldn't have an ordinary childhood. They couldn't, play baseball or play with I don't know, ordinary child games, be happily adjusted in school, and have loving parents. Somehow that never pitched the idea that the artist is a person apart, an outsider, a person who's been deprived the normal happinesses of life. And then there's always a discovery of an undiscovered talent hidden behind poverty or obscurity or struggle. So there's a lot of embellishment by artists themselves and by the people who write about them, about their childhood. So what do we know about Mahler's childhood? Not a lot, but he did come from a Jewish household, and he had some fragment of a Jewish calendar and Jewish education. But the surrounding world which he entered, particularly Vienna, was profoundly Catholic, very much tied to the theatrical Baroque tradition of Austrian Catholicism. Now, this sounds like a fancy bunch of words, but basically what it means is that if you ever go into churches in Vienna, as Mahler did, what will impress you about the churches, their architecture, is that they are indebted, because Vienna burned to the ground in 1683. And so all the architecture that surrounded Mahler as a living in Vienna, apart from the newly built stuff, was not medieval, was not Gothic, although there is a Gothic cathedral in the center of Vienna. It was Baroque, which are gilded altars, the Karlskirche by Fischer von Erlach. These are Brahms lived down the street from it. It's just magnificent 18th century painting, frescoes, sculpture, gilded altars with the light of the Holy Ghost. It's so impressive. It has grandeur and gesture. It's musical. The vectors of the light. Andras certainly knows that from Spanish Catholicism as it's imported in Latin America. It carries a lot of this Baroque theater. If you go into the churches of Mexico, you will see this, absolutely. So this Baroque Catholicism is in the ceremonies, the vestments, and the architecture of the church. And for a Jewish kid coming from Moravia, this was spectacular, totally spectacular, and fit into the operatic, theatrical quality of the music. He was so impressed by this. Interestingly, his encounter with Hans von Bülow, who was not Catholic, but Protestant, he encounters a different version of Christianity, one that's more austere. But both Lutheranism and Catholicism share something that his form of Judaism did not share. And that was a notion of the immortality of the soul and the redemption of human life beyond death. Mickiewicz, who is the author of the poem that inspired him, was also a devout Catholic. And Mickiewicz's life was very similar to Mahler in the sense that he was exiled. He was exiled from Poland after the uprising of 1830, and most of his life was spent in Paris in exile. Mahler projected the image and reality of being a man who had no home. He was not Moravian. He lived in Moravia, but his native language wasn't Czech. So imagine living in Red Hook and your major language is Spanish. You don't speak English at all. But all your neighbors speak Czech or German. In Moravia, most of them, they spoke both languages, but he was not a Czech patriot. He moves to Vienna, and he's a Jew in a Catholic city. He goes to Hamburg in North Germany, and now he's a Jewish guy trained in a Catholic world from Austria, and he's not a native there either. And he comes to America. He's not American, he's not Christian, and he's German, which was very popular in New York at the time. But in nowhere did he feel at home. He also, his entire career takes place from 1890 to 1911, which is the high water mark of political anti-Semitism in Europe. It's the year the Dreyfus trial begins. It's the year that political Zionism is invented, and where discrimination against Jews, Hans von Bülow is one of the advocates of anti-Jewish legislation in Prussia. He would like to restrict the immigration of Jews and the civil rights of Jews. So Hans von Bülow, who didn't like his music, was a notorious anti-Semite, like a racist, an absolute stone-cold racist. Through his entire career in Vienna, he was denigrated by many critics as if he were some sort of dirty Jew. And his music was considered typical of Jewish extravagance, lack of restraint, lack of discipline, and without any talent. He was also accused by Brucknerians, followers of Bruckner, who was a favorite of the right wing in Austrian politics, of corrupting Bruckner because he performed Bruckner with cuts, which was sacrilegious. So he was relatively isolated, and he had the misfortune of marrying the daughter of a very famous Viennese painter who was very gifted in music, who was herself a very complicated person, very gifted, but profoundly anti-Semitic herself. In order to get the job in Vienna, he had, however, to convert officially to Catholicism, because you could not get an official post like the director of the opera without being a member of the church. So in a place like the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, there was no separation between church and state. I couldn't be prime minister without being Catholic. I couldn't be a university professor without being converted. You could be a Protestant. You had to be a Christian. That was one of the problems Freud encountered in Vienna. But by the time he actually, the rules relaxed somewhat. But Mahler, in order to get the imperial appointment as director of the opera, converted to Catholicism. Given the Second Symphony, there's been a lot of debate of what his religious beliefs were. I've never had strong opinions about that. I've never given it that much thought. I don't think it's that relevant. Let me say the final thing about the work itself. The work is most of Mahler's symphonies, and it's true of the Second Symphony, are a theatrical mirror of the psychological, the internal journey of life, sorrow, happiness, hope, despair, fear. All the emotions you and I have are somehow poured in. It's a kind of psychological mirror. It is also, in this symphony, immensely affirmative. Why this symphony is so popular. Because it is, in the end, there is a structural musical redemption. Mahler is not content to use the Klopstock poem. The original Klopstock poem is quite short. The poem called Resurrection is very short. He added several verses, so he actually expanded the vocal choral closing of the symphony. And it is definitely about the idea that through music and through beauty and through touching the souls of other people, players, audience, you can transcend your mortality. It is a kind of expression of the immortality of the human through the arts, through aesthetic, through musical means. Music has always been a privileged art form in religions, exception for Calvinists, but certainly in the Catholic and Lutheran churches, and certainly in ancient Judaism, where of the 12 tribes, the second tribe in hierarchy, the first is the priestly tribe, and then comes the tribe of the musicians of the temple. And the idea that music is a mode of communication with the divine, which is a deeply ingrained part of Judaic thought, is now in this symphony wrapped up and reimagined in a Christian framework, in the idea of as being the instrument of resurrection. So the poem is crucial, but more important is the setting. And as you know, the symphony has a lot of interruptions and explosions, but both the Knaben Wunderhorn and the last one do actually tell a story about the eternal versus the temporal. So that's enough. I think I've talked enough about this. So questions.
Maestro, thank you so very much. And for the first time in 45 years, I just took notes.
Oh, that well. As I said, I spend more of my time worrying about this. I'm contracted by Yale University Press to write a short interpretive biography of Mahler. So it's on my mind, and so much has been written about this, and most of it is unreadable. But I can certainly refer students to things if they want to read about it.
Actually, yeah, maybe I'll get that from you, and I can send it out. Thank you so much. Okay, so of course we have some questions. So first is Mercer.
Okay, so I read my question aloud.
Go ahead.
Okay. In the chat I wrote, I just finished Theodore Reich's book called The Haunting Melody. So I have a question that's sort of related to the relationship between psychoanalysis and this symphony. And this is especially relates to Mahler's relationship with Bülow. And so Theodore Reich writes about the unconscious significance of the Totenfeier as serving as a representation of Mahler's ambivalent relationship with Bülow. And so Mahler's both like desperate for Bülow's approval and also absorbed in his own sort of hatred at Bülow because he was rejected by him. Do you buy the argument that we can say that the Totenfeier might have like an embedded unconscious death wish and within it? And Reich also writes that Mahler once he answered a question as to what he wants most to become with the answer that he wants to become a martyr. And do you think that this answer may apply to the Second Symphony? And does Mahler and also sort of does this mean that Mahler, to take the words of Klopstock, is sort of dying in order to live when the chorus all comes in unison together with that line? So yeah, I don't know if you just are interested in speaking to that.
Well, I can't tell you how impressive the question is. And I'm proud to teach at a college where such an intelligent and informed question is put forward, and unbelievably complicated. So let me back up a second. So as the Theodor Reich, for those of you who don't know, was a controversial in the generation after Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud, as you may all know, was also from Moravia, but also grew up in Vienna. And studied in Vienna and was a contemporary. And there is one recorded encounter between Freud and Mahler, and that has to do with a meeting they had when I think he was in Amsterdam conducting, and he arranged to meet with Freud. Apparently, it had to do with his wife's unfaithfulness and his inability to perform sexually with her. So it was an impotence question, which he apparently consulted Freud about. There's so much speculation about this, and it's a topic which absolutely doesn't interest me, but that's the one overlap between Freud and Mahler. Freud was particularly uninterested in music. That's the thing he was interested in painting, he was interested in literature, but music was somehow about Don Giovanni. Maybe it was as far as he got. There is a kind of black hole in Freud's own work and the musical. Even in the dream work, much of it is visual and linguistic. Now, subsequent generations found Gustav Mahler a perfect case for psychoanalytic interpretation. So, and there seemed to be enough evidence that made him a good candidate. With Reich's specific arguments, I think he's onto something. There is no doubt that because of Bülow's prominence, plus his virulent anti-Semitism, dealing with Bülow was very hard for Mahler. And there was hostility, as you suggest, hostility and admiration. The people who look down upon you, you end up, it's also in the Hegelian master-slave relationship. So there's always, as Hegel describes, you may be the master and I may be the slave, but somewhere I've absorbed your values. That's why prisoners and oppressors end up sharing values, right? So if you've suffered oppression under the boot of arbitrary power, if you reverse the position, your value structure has somehow been corrupted by that experience, and you return that. The oppressor begins to act, imitate that. That's why there's so much ambivalence about. So in this kind of dynamic, a dialectic, if you will, it's easy to read into outsmarting Bülow by creating a piece of music that actually has a much greater lifespan than Bülow. You have no reason to remember Hans von Bülow. I've recorded, again, I'm not talking about it, don't get me wrong about it. I'm the only person who have recorded in modern times an orchestral piece written by Hans von Bülow. And it's not very good, but I recorded it because it actually was important for people to hear what this very important guy, precisely the reason you're saying, because he was so important, so significant. It was interesting, he was not a good composer. The same thing as Nietzsche tried to compose, and the music isn't very good. So there are complicated psychological dynamic here. And remember, Bülow was hostile because this upstart, Mahler, was trying to do something he was not successful himself doing, being a composer-conductor. Because in the 19th century set of values, the real musician was the composer, not the performer. Nobody made a career in the 19th century just as a performer. Maybe a singer. Everybody wrote their own material. Rachmaninoff wrote his own material. He didn't just play Chopin or Beethoven or Liszt. He played his own stuff. And so Bülow tried, his tone poem is called Nirvana. So Bülow goes for a metaphysical system that comes out of Buddhism. There's a general search. So I think Reich is onto something. Now the martyrdom question goes to the heart of, so I hope you apologize I apologize for my answer. Mahler was a self-involved complainer, not a martyr. In other words, he was not a personality that he was deeply egotistical. So there's a kind of narcissism to Mahler. And narcissists always see themselves often as victims because they never get what they're due. So if you remember, psychoanalysis is a dangerous thing. First of all, it's who knows whether it's right or wrong. It's an intellectual theory. It's intellectual geography of the soul. Do I know that's right or wrong? But artists make great subjects for psychoanalysis. But it is what I would call what we call normal is a dangerous thing. And the sort of psychic instability that is associated with creativity clearly has biographical roots in the relationships that come out of family, whether they come out of family relationships, father relationships, surrogate father relationships, absent father relationships. Let's say in Mahler's case, he had an excessive protective relationship to his sister. Then in the middle of his life, he abandons all his old friends because they don't like his wife and his wife doesn't like them. Why does he marry a patent anti-Semite? Talk about self-hate, I mean, internalized self-loathing. So there is something, I wouldn't call it martyrdom, there is a dimension of self-loathing and a sense of worthlessness which has been internalized by the criticism he has to endure despite his enormous success. He's never quite happy. By the infidelity of his wife, by the rejection of him as the way anybody who is the victim of ethnic or racial discrimination feels, and that any kind of prejudice internalizes. So I think he was unlike Mendelssohn, for example, who was converted by his parents when he was 8. His conversion was clearly strategic on some level, you know what I mean? He had enough pride that he didn't want to do that. So he was not, I'm not sure he was a conversion of conscience, which some converts were. Look, I'm amazed you read Theodore Reich. I would never have believed that any undergraduate in 2020 would read Theodore Reich. I mean, that really, that's a throwback. But yeah, no, but there's no doubt that Theodore Reich was one of the analysts most interested in music. Yeah.
Thanks.
Next question.
Mercer, are you satisfied with your answer?
Oh my, Theodore Reich. Oh Jesus.
Yeah, I'm very satisfied. And also, I wanted to say that I thought in the Alex Ross, the quote from Maestro Botstein is also made me crack up a little bit. He writes that Mahler experienced far more triumph than defeat and more enthusiasm than rejection by audiences, and therefore Mahler shouldn't be whining about not being loved during his career.
Yeah, one of my things that I've argued in the literature as a scholar of this is that the depiction of Vienna as a kind of hostile, he was the most prominent guy there. I mean, and Bernstein helped institutionalize this idea of his being a martyr, which is just historically incorrect. It's as if you were, I don't know, you're Tom Hanks, and you're complaining about you know, how poorly you're doing in the movie business. You know what I mean? It doesn't make any, it doesn't add up. 2 and 2 doesn't make 4. You know what I mean? He was lionized. I mean, he was lionized. He and talk about marriage. He married status. He married the most beautiful, talented, most eligible woman in the entire city. So he was like Arthur Miller marrying Marilyn Monroe. That's exactly the analogy. Jewish playwright marries non-Jewish sex queen. That's what he did. So no one would have said that Arthur Miller was under a rock. She didn't marry the local Jewish grocer. So I mean that's so. My role is to, if you actually do the archival work and look at the historical record, it doesn't add up. It doesn't mean it was easy. I mean, he had vicious critic. His most vicious critic, actually, most influential critic, was himself Jewish and the son of a rabbi from Moravia, Robert Hirschfeld. So it wasn't the anti-Mahler music criticism of his conducting. One of the great critics of him, too, was the greatest music theorist of all of German-speaking Europe, Heinrich Schenker, who was actually an active member of the Jewish community, who went every Sabbath to synagogue and ran a kosher home. And he hated Mahler, and he hated his music, and he hated his conducting, and he was certainly a serious Jew. So it's very hard to add this up, you know, on one part of the ledger and the other part of the ledger. It's more complicated than it appears. Next question.
Henry.
Hi.
Hi, Henry.
Hi. My question is that given that music influences and is influenced by social climates, how is the desire of Brahms and composers similar to him, like the ones you talked about, to continue that tradition of older music and the tension of the push to create something new in music shared by the composers like Bruckner? How is that related to the politics of the time in Vienna that you've already lightly touched on?
Yeah, okay. Very good question. It's a very good question. Also, like the previous question, very complicated, very sophisticated question. Number one, Brahms and the people that followed in his line, and you can include in that people like Max Reger, believed that music was not a democratic mass art form. It was an art form of an elite, an educated elite, that their primary commitment was to chamber music, to purely instrumental. Brahms didn't write for large-scale forces, with the exception of the first piano concerto, the D minor, till the 1870s. And the reason he started to write because he saw how successful Wagner was with a large public. Wagner was a P.T. Barnum. He understood we're in the modern world with large cities, mass, you know, and big concert halls are being, that the audience of Beethoven. So the Eroica Symphony was premiered in a space that is a little bit bigger than a ballroom in Blythewood. Follow me? So you're talking about an audience-performer relationship that's very intimate. And a time when most large-scale events were dominated by amateurs participating with. So it was a real, like cricket, like an English sport, like cricket, right? And the average cricket is too complicated for the average person to figure out unless you really have access to it, right? It's an aristocratic sport, and like many sports, requires money. You have to have an instrument. You got to learn how to read. I mean, it is not for the average person. So Wagner makes the breakthrough of writing music that catches a wide audience. Bruckner, who is devoutly he's a church organist, and being of a religious persuasion makes a lot of sense to him. If he could reach the modern audience, a large audience, in a religious way through this new kind, like making religious movies, right? I made a religious movie. A lot of religions are believing in Jesus. Instead of having to read the Bible closely, if I can make a great movie about it, right, you'll buy it, right? Okay, so now my idea is, I'm going to use this orchestral form, I'm going to use this to the greater glory of God. And I'm going to reach it by a lot of repetition. So you don't have to know anything about music. You don't know anything about counterpoint. You don't know anything about harmony, really. All you have to do is recognize the tune. Bum, ba, ba, bum, 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 bum. If you hear it for 6 hours, by the time the 6 hours is over, you'll never forget it, right? Now, that's not the kind of thematic transformation you see in a Brahms symphony. Simply, you have to think musically to figure out what's happening. In Bruckner, it's blocks of sound that come back in different keys. So you're changing a harmony, you're saying the same thing. So you dye your hair pink, then you dye your hair black, then you dye your hair green. It's you, right? All the changes is your hair. Well, that's simple, that's easy to remember, right? But if you really transform your face into masks, where it's very hard to identify who you are, that requires some perception. And so that's the one political, what I would call a social divide. That led to Bruckner being a favored composer of the Austrian right wing, which favored a nationalist populist idea, what we call Christian socialism or pan-German development. So one of his patrons was Prince Liechtenstein, who had a palace in Vienna, and his riding school was the most important recital hall in Vienna. And Liechtenstein helped support Bruckner, and the right-wing ethnic nationalists, what we call nativist, white nativist people, let's say part of Donald Trump's backing, are white supremacists. So this sort of white Austrian Catholic supremacists loved Bruckner, because unlike most of the people in Vienna's music history or Austria's music history, he was a real Austrian. Like Schubert, he was an Austrian, he came from Linz. He was homegrown. He spoke in dialect. He was one of us, right? Mahler was definitely not one of us. Brahms came from northern Germany. He wasn't even Catholic. He was a Lutheran. So Brahms although he lived in Vienna for most of his life, he didn't cut it. Who liked Brahms? The anti-Semites used to say that Brahms was a kind of honorary Jew. He hung out with a lot of Jews and Jewish friends, and with liberals. He was politically liberal, and Bruckner was politically conservative. For example, there were 2 Wagner clubs in the University of Vienna. One was where anybody could join, and there was one that only Christians could join. And Bruckner was an honorary head of the one that only Christians could join. That gives you the political divide. So your question is very sophisticated, because Mahler is a kind of strange amalgam of all of this stuff. So it's quite clear he wants to reach a wide audience. He doesn't share, he's very contemptuous of Brahms. He thinks these people are precious and old-fashioned. He wants to meet the modern audience. He is absolutely sympathetic. For example, when the biggest exhibition space for modern art opened in 1897, he collaborated with modern painters. His productions in opera were no longer, if you did an opera and there was, a medieval knight wasn't bouncing around with armor trying to sing, or he was accused, there's in Valkyrie, for example, in the second act of The Ring, the wife of the chief of the gods, Fricka, comes in on a ram, with a ram, and Mahler said, fuck the ram. It's ridiculous. I'm not putting a ram on stage. I don't care what kind of ram. And he starts to strip the opera of the Wagnerian symbolism. And he plays with light and color as a symbolic. He is an ancestor of what later Wieland Wagner does after the Second World War, where all you see is Wotan with a spear and it's a blank stage. It's about black and white and good and evil. It's simplified. Mahler says he pioneers in these really modern, what's viewed as modern visual productions. He wants to be a modern. There's no question about it. And he's not wildly sympathetic to Brahms. And to that continuation, he considers academic, old-fashioned, and too tied to a world of aristocratic patronage. He already enters music when it's a business, if you know what I mean. You earn your money from publishing, you earn your money from performance fees, which you get paid to play, and not because some king or knight, gave you a couple of pennies. So there is this whole idea of the independent free artist. Mahler's politics probably were, certainly in his youth, not conservative. Jews, the way minorities in the United States, whatever happens in 2020, if you look at the vote differential between Democratic and Republican, you'll see that the overwhelming majority of people of color, descendants from the American slaves, will not vote Republican. Right. The same was true, and the only white majority that voted in overwhelming numbers, close to 80% for Hillary Clinton, were the American Jewish population. So minorities don't suffer ethnic, national purity politics very well. And so Mahler would have been unsympathetic to a right-wing, monarchical, aristocratic, or populist, right-wing populist idea. And during his career in Vienna were the first real socialist demonstrations for universal suffrage. And there's some evidence that he was very sympathetic to that. Bruckner was a very old, and that's the irony, that Bruckner, although represented the modern in some musical sense, he was unbelievably conservative politically and unbelievably conservative. Does that help? It's a complicated geography, this thing. It doesn't quite line up. Bruckner dies in the 1890s and Mahler in 1911, so they both died before the First World War, which of course brings the 19th century to an end. So in that context, he is certainly not. And Brahms is very instrumental in Mahler getting hired, even though he didn't care much. I mean, he didn't know much about the music, but he went to Budapest actually when the emperor decided he was looking for a new chief conductor. Karl Goldmark, actually, a bunch of people conspired to get Brahms, who was extremely curmudgeon-y, to go to Budapest to hear Mahler conduct Don Giovanni. Mahler, he was very impressed. So he came home and he said, hire this guy, which was controversial. He was Jewish. So Brahms consistently acted on the liberal side, even when it wasn't in his taste. Brahms is to be admired because he was very self-critical, something Wagner wasn't, and Bruckner wasn't. Bruckner was self-critical in the sense he was self-critical. He was insecure about his ability to control symphonic form. But Brahms was viciously self-critical and burned at age 60. Music it was a tragedy, but music he didn't think was good enough to be published. But there's a famous story that he's invited for lunch at the home of a composer, in this case, a Jew, a contemporary, a composer of light music, more or less, a couple of operas, and had a very good family life and had a nice suburban home. Because when they tore the walls down of Vienna, they unified all the suburbs around it into one big city. Okay, so Brahms is invited for lunch, And he arrives, and his wife says, he asked, where's your husband? And she says, oh, he's out playing with the children. He composes so hard that he really has time only on the weekend to play with the children. And Brahms said, tell your husband he should play with the children more and compose less. No. So his stock in trade wasn't being generous, but he had a very keen eye for talent. And so he played a behind the scenes role in getting Mahler to Vienna in 97. Good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Leon. I think just so that you can go write some more or whatever is up next, just keep the final last two questions.
Last two questions. Yeah.
Alex, both slightly different twinges of questions, but you'll enjoy them both.
Yeah, so whenever I listen to any Mahler symphony, automatically I think, okay, nature. It's the first thing I think of when I listen to any Mahler symphony. And I was just wondering why it had such a huge impact on his work, and whether he was somebody who was interested in natural sciences, or if he was just inspired by the places that he lived in.
Very good question. Very good question. So the question is, again, complicated. There are two answers to it. So let's keep the analogy that he was born in Red Hook. Okay, so Red Hook is not a big place, right? And Red Hook is more landscape than city, right? More rural landscape than city. So, and Mahler did like the out of doors. He always spent the summer in the countryside, and he composed in a hut on the Wörthersee, which is a kind of, I don't know, like an Adirondack Lake Placid or some kind of, Midwestern lake, beautiful lake country. You know what I mean? Yeah, in Wisconsin or Minnesota, something like that, right? With mountains in the background. Not the seaside so much. So number one, he grew up not in an urban setting, and so that there was a childhood memory. There's a lot of memory in Mahler. I mean, your question is strong, and that goes to the first question, which was about psychoanalysis. The use of pop tunes and march tunes is a lot about mental memory. You remember when we did the Third Symphony, and you had the post horn, and these are like, if your parents read you stories, nursery rhymes, that's why you liked Grimm's fairy tales, and that's why the idea was writing a fairy tale opera sounds like a good idea, right? It has to do with the loss of innocence and the loss of that coming of age into an adult involves loss. And that's why marriage in many traditional families is considered a form of loss, a form of departure, analogous to death, because the person comes from innocence in childhood into independent adulthood. The loss of innocence was also mirrored in their mind by the industrialization of the landscape. Your question is very, very pertinent, because it is in their lifetime that they see a kind of rape of the environment. Railroads, factories, cities, that the pure natural world seems at risk by man's inventiveness and science. So there's a kind of romantic attachment to the sound of nature and the appearance of nature as being opposed to the cold, heartless, rational character of the economic life that is underneath a big city. So Mahler is actually a modern composer that's overwhelmed by nostalgia, which is why he liked early 19th century literature. And Strauss gets it too. Tremendous nostalgia. That's a very good question. There's a tremendous nostalgia, as if they're living in a time when, the Lord of the Rings, when the trees, yeah, that's the idea. What Tolkien picks up as a 19th century tradition of a kind of opposition of industry and respect for nature. And Mahler's in the respect for nature. And music seems somehow, this irony, of course, is music is the most artificial of arts. I mean, except for the times where you're asked to imitate, let's say with your instrument, you can imitate, a dark voiced bird, or in the, I don't know what you do in the carnival animals, or in Peter and the Wolf. You can do things that seem like you're imitating nature, but not like a painter or a poet. You can't talk about the dawn or the sunset. You can't quite do that so easily in music as you can do that, because music is artificial. I mean, what does the dawn sound like? We know what it looks like. We know how we will talk about it, but we don't really know what it sounds like. And why the opening of Also sprach Zarathustra, which is the rising of the sun, why that's in C major, why it has that shape, is an arbitrary rhetoric. So it's interesting that in this arbitrary rhetoric of music, there is a kind of appeal to the purity and beauty of nature. But definitely, the third symphony is all about nature, as you remember. That's a nature symphony, and not the only one. Not the only one in Mahler.
Leon, your comment about the arbitrary rhetoric of the keys takes us to our last question with Alex Levinson.
Oh, the C minor, you mean? Yeah.
Well, yes. I just read about the piece that it's labeled as either C minor or E flat major. And first of all, I was wondering, first of all, how you figure that out, how you put the stamp, okay, this is a C minor piece. Second of all, why it's even important to know what tonality. Okay.
Oh yeah, great question. So I'm just trying to see. Let me just, I want to check. I don't want to make a mistake. I hate saying that. So I have always thought of the piece as being in C minor, not in E flat, despite the relation between the two keys. So it's sort of irrelevant. The first movement has a clear dominant C minor orientation. So let's take even the most famous C minor symphony in all of literature, which is the Beethoven 5, right? But it ends in C major. So why are we talking about it in C minor? What is he talking about? It's a journey from C minor to C major. Why do we take the name of the symphony from the opening chord, or even the tonality of the first movement, and apply it to the whole symphony? So your question is very good. I've never understood. By the way, Mahler never used the name Resurrection for the symphony, by the way, just that you know. He didn't title it himself. He handed us a novel number 2. There was no title to the thing. But you raised the question of harmonic usage in Mahler. And that's why you're C minor, E flat. So the dominant harmonic vocabulary is in the apposition of minor and major. So you put your finger on something that's very important to Mahler. Even in the presentation of melodic material, you will see right away that it switches very rapidly. The minor-major relationship is a dominant tool for him as a composer. So the tonal relationships are one is that. So the fact that C minor and E flat major are related in that way, it also allows him, that's one relationship. The other relation would be C minor, C major, or E flat major, E flat minor. But more important is that he also is in the business of interrupting two kinds of things: melodic continuity and the continuity of fabric. So if you look at a Brahms symphony, what's interesting is that the sonority is pretty continuous. Right? Mahler breaks it up. Mahler shatters the surface of continuity and uses harmony to do that also. There are abrupt shifts where the relationships to your ear are, as well as orchestration shifts. In that sense, he is less slitheringly chromatic than Strauss. See? So the turns in Mahler, harmonic turns, have a tendency to be often sharper, which is what attracted him to many of the founders of so-called, what we call non-tonal or atonal music. That when Schoenberg describes the emancipation of the dissonance or the extension of tonality, he has Mahler in mind. Although Mahler's relatively, he's a very tonal composer, but he does experiment with color relationships that are harmonic contrast. But you put your finger on the question of minor and major is a major tension in the work. So calling it to be is an inheritance of an 18th century practice. So reason 18th century practice, you could say that, I haven't looked at it a long time, but most Mozart symphonies or Haydn symphonies probably where the key, it's in a certain key because that's really the orientation. These symphonies key, I was recently looking at a work we were going to do, and the question you asked was right there. I didn't know whether this could be either. It's like your question. It could be one of two keys, and I was interested to notice that in the literature, it often is referred to without any key at all. Symphony number 3, with no key, because actually the question you asked. I think this is a habit which is misleading, and there are many moments where the tonal center shifts. So, but I have to look at it. As I remember it, so I'm doing it by memory. I think the first movement clearly has a C minor focus to it, and that's probably why the first movement has a tendency to give a symphony its title. So the same thing. So the C minor symphony of Beethoven is a good example. It's in C minor because that's what it opens in. That minor third, that's it. Did that answer the question? It's a good question. It's
Yes, basically.
yeah. There's especially to me, as a personal. For example, we don't say "Also Schwachsutra Zarathustra" in X key, right? We don't say that. We just call it by it is, which is the right thing to do. You make a very good point, especially duration. It's one thing to have a key in your ear, a color tonality, if this whole symphony is 20 minutes long. But this thing is what, 70 minutes long? That's just too much. We don't say Parsifal in E. We don't put a key on an opera because there are many keys in the opera, and who gives a damn what it starts in, right? So your position and the whole point of what key is the Tristan Prelude in? Ooh. People have earned tenure on this question. You know what I mean? So the harmonic analysis of this stuff gets very complicated the further down the line you go. That's a good question. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this was a pleasure. I hope it's interesting stuff. And the piece is theatrical. The most important thing is it has a architectural and narrative theatricality about it. And there's no doubt about it. It has some kind of argument which is spiritual and metaphysical. On that note, I will see you all on Thursday, I think.
Maestro, don't go away.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you, and also we want to keep advertising to the students that we would like them to be making their videos of what they're doing at home musically for Bard Music Connects.
Oh yes, great.
Frank and I would like to ask if you might be willing to put this up to show what you're doing at home on Bard Music Connects, to put the recording of the lecture you just gave, because it
Oh
was,
yeah, you can use whatever you have. I just apologize. Make sure
give him a little
make
applause.
sure that but make sure that whoever makes the introduction, whether it's you or saying that I'm doing this as a conversation, I don't have lecture notes. I mean, I'm doing this largely from memory, so there may be, you know, I may make inadvertent errors, um, and so I apologize for any errors ahead of time. So.
All right, we can discuss if you're not sure, but I think it would be
No, I'm happy to do anything that I can do that'll be helpful. I'm very fond of all of you and very fond of, and can't wait to get back to work in real time, in real space, which will happen.
We love you and we love.
Well, we love you. The love is returned. You take care of yourselves, ladies and gentlemen.
Bye, Maestro. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.